Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Almut Rochowanski, who has been supporting activists and their organizations in the former Soviet Union for over 20 years, focusing on peace, women's, and human rights. In the course of this work, she developed a critique of the role of foreign funding in civil society development, new democracies' political economies, and ultimately geopolitics. In addition, she researches the comeback of militarism in Europe and its implications for peace. She is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I welcome Almut Rochowanski to Savage Minds. Since my work in South America, many years ago, I was living in Peru and Bolivia. I came across NGOs and saw a bit of what later would be told to me was a kind of rearranging of the deck chairs on the Titanic when it comes to the intervention of certain organizations, including the UN. In fact, this was said to me about the UN in Haiti many years later in 2010 when I was working on child trafficking projects. And one of the things that I notice about international development models, particularly the NGO-industrial complex, is the harm that invokes upon societies that it ostensibly is there to help. In my work on this theoretically and practically, I came to the conclusion that a lot of what is the NGO-industrial complex is merely an extension of colonialism, albeit under a different face, a different model. And I wanted to know, I've read a lot of your work now, and I'm interested in how your ideas align with many aspects of dependency theory, emphasizing how foreign-funded development can hollow out local democracy while also creating self-perpetuating cycles of reliance. To sum up, dependency theory is an idea that rose to prominence in area studies primarily in the 1950s and 1960s, which is fundamentally a Marxist-based framework explaining how global wealth and inequality stems from a core periphery system whereby wealthy nations exploit the poorer ones, extracting their resources and labor, hindering the periphery's ability to develop itself through unequal trade, political control, and economic structures established during colonialism, creating a cycle of underdevelopment. And dependency theory also argues that development isn't universal, but it's polarized, that poverty is not a natural entity, but it's there by design, with core nations benefiting from periphery resources, challenging modernization theory by stating that poor nations aren't just behind, but actively kept underdeveloped by the global capitalist system. Thus, according to dependency theory, many development projects actually harm developing countries by entrenching them in a state, in a cycle also, of underdevelopment, rather than helping them progress. And the same theorists from the 50s, 60s, and this went on, I learned about this in the late 80s, these theorists also have argued that instead of being a solution, development models and the NGO machinery often serve as tools for the wealthy core nations to maintain control over the periphery. Hence, I would like if you could begin with discussing your ideas of development to include where they fit in with dependency theory.
The vast majority of what is summed up as NGOs are just people who are trying to do interesting work while somehow making a living from it, ideally. That is the bulk of it. And let's not forget that the vast majority of people who make a living or part of their living from what is called an NGO, and that can be a lot of things, are natives or members of the communities in which they work. They're not foreigners. The money that runs this industry certainly is in most places foreign, so that's a really important thing to think about. But like when you keep thinking about it and you sort of like think, you burrow down to the next level and then to the next level, and you say, well, there's another layer I can peel off and there's another layer I can peel off to try to explain what's going on here, because you enter these spaces and from the moment you enter, you're struck by dysfunction and toxicity. And this dysfunction and toxicity, they coexist with inspiration and good work uh, and really, really good things happening, often life-saving, existential things happening. So it's very weird, right? Because it is also often the only space in which, or a dominant space in which saving of lives and making lives better happens, because it sort of gets displaced into this industry, gets pushed into this industry. And so you enter the space and you do good things, but then you also realize like something is very, very dysfunctional here and very miserable. And so you start to peel off these layers and you start to think about, like politics and agendas and sort of esoteric agendas. And why is it so weird that we feel so tossed around and pushed and pulled in various directions? And in the end, you realize, well, it is about money. Ultimately, the last layer you peel off is that somebody has money and provides it to others, but with very strange selection criteria and mechanisms and conditions. And so yeah, and then money, of course, is just sort of the currency of power, right? And that's where things get sort of very, I guess, kind of very simple, very like very clear. Um, but I began by saying, like, this is all too complicated, is that the vast majority of people who work in this, beginning with this, the bulk of the people who are just members of their own communities where this happens around the world, but then also even up to like the mostly Western or international, professional managerial types who sit sort of at the nodes of the system, as grants officers and whatnot. They don't do it because they want to, preserve Western economic control over the resources of this and that country or anything like that. It's far more complicated than that. It is so much more complicated.
So you're saying that they're good faith actors on the ground who believe in what they're doing.
Yeah, the vast majority of the actors are good faith actors. The vast majority.
Mm-hmm.
There are very few, and I mean the problem begins with the definition of what is a good faith actor. Like you can do some really stupid and ruinous things, believing in good faith that you're doing a good thing.
True.
I mean, like you could actually be a fervent believer in the idea, and it's just to say something very, very simple, that a deregulated free labor market is better for everybody, that will actually like allow people to become wealthy and happy. And you could really truly believe that. Most NGOs don't actually deal with these things. So that's the thing. Like most people, most organizations, most entities, institutions that are classified as NGOs don't actually work on these big questions, on these political questions. Um, you know, it just they just inhabit an ecosystem that is connected to these political questions, and it just so that they're like, and it's complicated. So like there's one book recently came out, I think last year or the year before, by a British academic. I think her last name is Sassoon, but I'm not sure now. And she traces the beginning of the NGO sector and its growth to sort of, I guess you could call it Cold War liberalism, but almost like a different wrinkle, like a different idea of it. And that was that in the mid 20th century, there was a very strong notion among Western charities like Oxfam. Oxfam now is very much on the left, but back then not, that distrusted the state and that thought that like people to people solidarity was a better way to do things. But that idea aligned with sort of the displacement and pushing back of the state in fulfilling core functions in developing societies, and frankly, then also in Western societies ultimately, right? And that this sort of initiated the growth of the NGOs, or what became NGOs. We really need to talk about the nomenclature here too, because it's so revealing in the development of this industry. But the industry really did take off right after the end of the Cold War. And initially I thought like, oh, like end of the Cold War, sort of like, end of history, But I think you could also say that the 90s were also just, including in the West, like a period of sort of like rapid, sort of the hype, the peak of privatization and pushing the state out of core functions. And that's probably what made them so attractive.
I'm aware of Sassoon's work on this subject, Tahila Sassoon, and she discusses this history also, as you just stated, emerging from also the British Empire. When I referred initially to the model of dependency theory, the reason why this was so controversial to people back in the mid 20th century is that many people saw what you've experienced. For instance, they saw the dangers of having foreign funded NGOs create this kind of vacuous space within civil society where anyone could step in. Right? And I saw this a lot in Latin America. I saw, in fact, danger.
What do you mean by anyone could step in?
When you have states that are able to be taken over in a very literal way, as we've just seen now with Maduro in the United States, or where you see what happened in Bolivia in the 1970s, where the Peace Corps was booted out of the country because these doctors that were sent there believed that they were doing the right thing. They were sent there to do a mandate, basically, of sterilizing part of the indigenous population. And this kind of policy is being carried out in the name of who? When you're on the ground, and I saw this in Haiti as well, people were given orders to take care of a small project that they thought within their 3-month, 6-month contract they could do, but they realized very quickly that there was no way this was going to happen. So they were given on paper a mandate that lacked any kind of integration within, one, the society, two, who's making these decisions. They had no idea often why they were doing what they were doing. It became this kind of hollow version of civil society in certain instances where organizations look effective on paper, but deep down, they have no connection to the society at hand, often even the governments, right? And so they're viewed as foreign agents. And when you go to Haiti, you're talking about not just NGOs, but over 10,000 INGOs on the ground. It was almost comic, but in order to get from point A to B in Port-au-Prince, you were better off walking sometimes because for all the cars on these very narrow roads, they were all NGO and UN cars. There was no room for local people to even move on their own roads for the plethora, really, 10,000 NGOs.
So what you're trying to say is if when you say like somebody can just show up, somebody can just step in, it's not just somebody. I mean, if you and I made a decision to go to country X and do stuff there, we would be laughed out of the room unless we brought something with us. And that's something, and you could say, oh, like we will just have these like brilliant ideas. And like you can always find 2, 3 people like you for your ideas if if they are good, if they're interesting. But fundamentally, you have to bring something more. You have to bring something material to the table. You have to bring money, or you have to bring the promise of money. And people in these very deprived communities understand very well that, for social mobility, for often like literally just mobility, just to get out of there, right? You have to do certain things, like you have to learn, how to use a computer, how to use the internet, how to speak English, and then go like collect certificates from like NGO trainings, and that will be a way to which you might get a job in one of these organizations, and then that might net you a job in the capital, and then from there you could get a fellowship abroad, and then you could stay there. So that's sort of, so it's not even that you, as foreigners, you come in with money, but you come with sort of with this like implicit promise of material betterment or of opportunity. And I should again very much say this isn't just a like egotistical thing that people want for their own greed. Often and I think this is actually the key thing to understand, often the resources that we as foreigners dangle in front of these communities are so attractive because they would allow people to address the very severe problems that they diagnose in their communities. That's sort of it's almost like blackmailing. It's almost extortionate. Like you go into a place and you will encounter women who are trying to help other women who are protecting themselves from gender-based violence, from their violent husbands, right? And so you need to like offer them a shelter, like a place to hide. And that is like wherever you go in the world, that is like such a conundrum for them, like because getting real estate is really difficult, right? It's costly. And so wherever you go in the world, like, your women's rights activists will tell you, look, we can, with our little resources, with our pennies or just nothing, we can hold trainings, we can have meetings, we can talk to each other, we can give advice, but we cannot fundamentally like help a woman who's to run away and like spend a night in a safe place. So, and then somebody shows up and says, we have a bit of money and like we can do that. And so you're a godsend. And you're a godsend for good people who are trying to do good things in their communities. And I think that's what makes it so appealing and so seductive and ultimately so problematic. It is not even that it exploits or relies on people's ability for their own betterment and for their career ambitions or for their social mobility. I think it is fundamentally that what we're trying to do there and the research we present actually aligns with activists and communities' aspirations for addressing the problems they see. And then, of course, the toxic thing about it is that it comes with very narrow and often very capricious conditions for how exactly you can do that. So I mentioned real estate, but interestingly, the thing is that, very often the conditions are actually you can only offer sort of a bootstrap approach of people helping themselves. Like you can offer a woman job training so she can ostensibly earn money and that way acquire economic security, but you cannot actually offer a roof over her head. And this is, you will encounter this all over the world. And in a majority of countries, I think anywhere over the world, the reality is simply that a woman, even if she does do job training and even if she does find paid employment, that paid employment is not enough to put a roof over her head. Um, so it's a fiction that's being sold there. And the in between sort of the donors and the women on the ground who are trying to achieve this, basic sort of modicum of economic security and physical security are these activists who are trying to mediate that, and they're trying to negotiate these toxic, capricious, weird conditions and the scarcity that is a reality, right? Because like ultimately all the money that goes into the sex sector, it's not very much if you think about it. Well, it's a lot of money goes into some parts of it, less in others. It's not unclear like what it actually buys. But um the actors in the middle who are trying to negotiate that and to like try to do that, they often have to deploy like trickery to get to the places where they actually can help their communities in the way they want to. So there's a real tension inherent often in the relationship between the activists who receive this funding and the Western, the foreign donors who give it. And yeah, very much. I mean, this is a reality. Like, so there's this stereotype out there, this caricature that like when the CIA goes into countries and creates faux astroturfed NGOs that it then deploys for color revolutions. And these are just like its little paid foot soldiers. But that is like not the true. I mean, I'm sure the CIA tries to do that, but that is like a tiny, tiny aspect of a much greater, much messier, much more complex reality. And the reality is that most activists, most grant recipients are, um, there's tension. They are, recalcitrant. They don't want to do what we tell them to. They resist. Of course, what also then happens is that those who resist more tend to not get so much money and so much favor, and those who like perfectly align with donors' agendas get rewarded. But this is not sort of a top-down power vertical at all. Like there's a lot of resistance, a lot of this resistance you could also say would be, like borderline criminal. where people basically just like sort of, embezzle money, like that totally also exists. But a lot of it, and I think that's more relevant, is that, like people in extremely resource poor, desperate conditions, um, will, with, really good intentions and in good faith, try to manipulate what they can in order to better serve the communities. That is a reality I've observed many times.
I noticed in Haiti, well, this was the UN where they were coming from all over the world. The ones who were actively working within the UN, for instance, were coming from extremely wealthy familial backgrounds, extremely educated backgrounds. For instance, let's take your work in Georgia. When you were there, did you notice that people working in this sector tended to be of the upper middle class, upper classes?
I mean, Georgia is an interesting example because it's a post-Soviet state. So, in a way, elite status was translated and preserved during the Soviet era, but there was a lot of social mobility from, peasant and poor backgrounds too. So you could in an NGO, like it's true, like when the NGOs started, like when foreign funders started coming in the early 90s, and I wasn't there in the early 90s, but I know the stories, and started to talk to people. They would predominantly talk to dissidents, um, or like dissident types, but their family, like, and those were generally, educated people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their parents already were. Then but this is a post-Soviet specific. Now, if you're talking about places like, I don't know, Pakistan, it's very different, right? Like you have parts of the developing world where social mobility that are extremely unequal, and where social mobility and classes and caste systems really do, like do play a big role in that, and that can be true now. So like I mean, but then you have a country like India, and India is a place where grassroots mobilization and activism among the lower castes can be highly effective, and actually incredibly confident, including towards their foreign donors. So none of these stories are quite as clear cut. Now, yeah, I mean, the UN is a system, it's ostensibly a meritocracy in some ways, which means you have to check certain educational boxes, such as being multilingual, and, being up for an international career in the first place. And having, at this point, probably, most of these would require a master's degree. But it's also not purely a meritocracy because, in a lot of ways, it's uh, for like, especially the senior, their quotas for nationalities inside the UN system, and they function differently across the UN system. So like in the Secretariat, they function differently than in the agencies and programs. But that's also always a consideration, or just to be very blunt, on the ground in a field office, they might say, we really need to have some Swedes or some Americans or some Brits on the staff here, because in this country, the US or the Swedish or the British embassy is making a lot of money and making a lot of grants. And so we need someone, it helps to have some of their own people to do that. So it's not purely a meritocracy in that respect. But yes, so the people who work in these places are typically, um, professional managerial types, very well educated, multilingual. And in a lot of countries, that would translate into a particular class background. But I mean, another thing that you also see is that these this industry is a social lift, and in a lot of places, it is a mechanism for talented people to succeed in their personal career ambitions. And one thing that's very interesting is when you look at um, the staff of major INGOs or UN agencies, that a lot of them in their younger years sort of, happen to live in a country that was experiencing a conflict or a major crisis. And this is where their career started, or even a refugee camp, right? Like from the 2000s, there were a lot of Bosnians in organizations doing humanitarian aid all over the world who had started their careers as young people in Bosnia. So you can see that again and again. So it's everything is, I mean, of course, what it also means is that, even if they don't come necessarily from privileged backgrounds, they have now joined an elite with, certainly in a material sense in terms of status, and this is the requirement to sit at that desk in the UN country office and do this work. I mean, it is, like very technocratic work. It does require certain skill sets. I wouldn't, like, they're not nuclear physics. Most people could do them. These days you have to do, a little light. Like you have to be able to make a nice spreadsheet and some graphs and stuff and write reports. It's not, but it's, yeah, I mean, it isn't something that just anybody could do. The question is, do they still work with communities in a meaningful way and in a democratic way and in a participatory way?
There's also a whole industry for making your life doing just that. So it becomes, in a way, a kind of NGO pyramid complex where everyone who wants to get involved sees a future career for themselves. And they work it very hard because that is one way of, and I'm not talking about the poor only. I have family members in India who come from an upper middle class, very educated background who see the NGO industry as a way to create a niche prestige profession for themselves. Because these professions
Yeah, and I think that's no longer just true for India. I think that's very much true in the West now. And I don't think it was in the same way 30 or 40 years ago, but it certainly is now.
This is the issue that I mentioned at the very beginning. To what degree people realize or understand the links between colonialism and NGOs themselves, and the savior complex of people. Again, we have to make the distinction between INGOs and NGOs, but people coming from outside to quote unquote rescue people. And that was the kind of Peace Corps model at one point that was prevalent in the 50s and 60s. Then you have the model of the nationals, locals, who might come back from doing degrees overseas, but they are there to do what they believe to be much needed work to develop, whatever that means, again, because development has so many now definitions, both toxic and quote unquote progressive, which is also can be looked at as toxic as well. And the problems is that you've got these standards of sovereignty and dignity that are also recreated. Who's deciding on what sovereignty means when you have NGOs coming in and eliding even local rules or laws, or who are able to create rules and laws? I'll give you an example. I would go quite often to Armenia, a summer lecture series within this art community. And this art community was sponsored by the Ford Foundation. One thing that struck me is, of course, when you're dealing with artists and art curatorial programs, as I was, you don't expect to be facing the poorest of poor within that society. At the same time, you also don't expect to be coming against people who are being educated in queer theory. And that was going on at the time. And I was wondering, well, why is this being filtered here? Well, it was through these grants. A lot of the grant writing processes, and I saw this as a graduate student in New York in the 90s as well, you write grants that you think will get you that money. And the one thing you learn to do, even as a graduate student, but writing grants for organizations, is what are the key words that are needed to get that money. And you make sure that your grants have those key words. Gender's a great key word. Queer's a great key word. And so you learn about how to make money or to earn the money that will come through in all sides, even an extension of that same grant. When I saw what was happening there in terms of this kind of ideological capture, I was a bit alarmed because these weren't autochthonous ideas coming out from Armenian curatorial practices. This was definitely an ideological capture coming through Ford Foundation and other grants. There was the Soros Foundation as well. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, where there is ideological capture that comes through this funding.
I I have to say, so like Armenia is an interesting case because first of all, you didn't need foreign donors just making grants to bring queer theory there. Armenia has an American University of Armenia, and all the bright young things go there. And I know some of them. And here's the thing: to many of them, queer theory might be a revelation. Just like it is a revelation when in the West they first encountered it as an undergraduate. It really like so Armenians are post-Soviet peoples, but they are also people who have been minorities in a very wide region of the world, having to adjust to other cultures and take the best from them and learn to get along with them and to thrive. I mean, Armenians, if you look at the Armenian diaspora all over the world, there are quite a few artists and writers. There's William Saroyan in America and there's Charles Aznavour in France. Like these are people who are good at absorbing culture and thriving with it and running with it. So I wouldn't discount. Yes, there will always be people who will just sort of cram their grant applications with the right word, the right jargon. And I have to say, the grant officers, especially at really big technocratic, like bilateral grant makers, governments, right? They appreciate that because it helps them check the boxes on the evaluation template that they have, which literally functions that way. It helps them if it mentions gender 23 times because then they can, assign the points and then like it makes the decision easier. So that exists, but that we shouldn't discount entirely that people around the world will encounter ideas and actually find them persuasive and find them liberating. Um, Not every idea has to be generated, authentically, locally, like it just grew out of the rocks in the ground. That's not true for us, and it doesn't have to be true anywhere in the world.
True, but a lot of these people were telling me they were pushing back on it. And it was very hard to push back because the grants were given on the basis of this kind of acceptance that you would cover this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally with you on that. I just want to say, like, it's not what it does is so the process in which it works is that those locals whose own ideas perfectly align with those of the donors without having to do violence unto themselves, without having to fake it, for them, this is perfect. Like you will, when you're an activist and you encounter activists from all over the world, all over your career, we will always sit together at a bar around the kitchen table and we will bitch and moan about how hard it is to contort ourselves to fit the capricious and constantly changing prescriptions of the donors. And then every once in a while, one in 1,000, you will meet somebody, I don't know what you're talking about. It's always been easy for me. I've never had to hand the grant. I've never been disappointed. I've never been turned down unfairly. I've never had to contort myself. And you understand, so there is this one person out there who really did fit the agenda of whatever source the money was coming from, but is exceptional. And so yeah, for others it distorts and this is just the thing because it's also very hard to walk away from the money. Like it would be you would think, oh well, then just don't take the money, just don't take the grants, don't let yourself be contorted by sort of artificially implanted concepts of queer theory, whatever. And that sounds very noble, but it also means you can't keep the lights on, you can't pay your staff, and if you're an artist, that means you can't do art at all. So this is, like in conditions where resources are so extremely scarce, um, people will contort themselves to fit around them. And, this is hardly something that's unique to the NGO industry. This is a reality that exists in a lot of spaces. The result is that certain ideas and certain directions become more prominent in a sort of in an artificial way, like not in a way that would authentically happen. I mean, you could question what authentic even means, because authentic, like let's talk about Armenia. Authentic would mean that you would have a highly patriarchal, nationalist, sort of nationalist clerical culture that would actively suppress a lot of genuinely authentic ideas. So and that is also one of the reasons why some actors, like artists, activists, journalists, actually consider foreign money such a godsend, because it's sort of like it sort of magically empowers them, like amplifies their power in ways that wouldn't be available to them by just contesting existing power relations in their own society. And you could say, well, then that means it's not authentic, but it can still mean liberation for certain groups of people, and can feel that way. But it gets very complicated from there, because that breeds resentment. Um, then again, even where groups of people fight for their own liberation without any outside support, that also breeds resentment and a backlash, as we see. So the thing is that a lot of grant makers, a lot of foundations and bilateral grant makers, and just in general, the professional class that are in like philanthropists, professional philanthropists, they do a lot of thinking about this. They are aware of these problems. And for a good many decades already, they've tried to address this by things like what they call participatory grant making. But these attempts are all too few, too tentative, too cautious. Because ultimately, if they were genuine about it, they would have to give up all of their power, and they're just not going to do that, right? Um, I mean, philanthropy is a complicated, like philanthropy in a narrower sense, right? Like private philanthropy, rich people, rich institutions making their money available for causes that are, you know, not necessarily in their interest, or in any like narrow way in their interest. That's where things get more complicated. Another thing is bilateral foreign aid. We can safely assume that governments, any government anywhere, is not going to spend money in another country just out of the goodness of their heart. We know it because they pursue certain objectives with that. Those objectives don't need to necessarily be exploitative, extractive, violent, oppressive, colonial. Um, but they're still their objectives, and they're ultimately serving their own foreign policy strategy. And that, like, I don't know, like it's very hard to like to get away from that. Like to ever like the money always has that Midas touch, right? Like it does good things, and it is attractive and appealing, and it can seem a lifesaver. But when you introduce it into civil society spaces, or art spaces, or media spaces, it has this Midas touch. It turns things stale and problematic and toxic. And there's really nothing you can do despite trying. Like I said, there are people who try to do that, like they try to do participatory grant making and regranting, and they try to do things like a very common complaint you will hear all over the world is like, why do you always just fund projects that are very sort of like tightly defined and narrow and very technocratic, and you make all the conditions and rules and sort of ideas that you want promoted? Why don't you just give us core funding and let us do the thing that we want to do, core flexible funding? Now, if you're a nonprofit anywhere in the world, particularly in the West, core or flexible funding is sort of the gold standard. It's the badge that you've made it. The higher percentage of your funding is core funding, the more successful of an NGO you are. Like it's almost more important than how much money you have total, because it means that donors see you and like you and just say, okay, here's money, you do what you think is best. And the other thing is like donors look at you and they see, here's somebody who's very good at doing like water and sanitation projects. Let's contract them to do water and sanitation projects that we want done, right? Which is not core funding. So the gold standard is core flexible funding. There's a lot more of that in the West going to our own domestic nonprofits or NGOs, whatever you want to call them. And we really need to talk about the naming because I think there's a lot of material there. So maybe we can do that next. And there's a lot less of that in foreign aid funding. Like core flexible funding is a very rare exception in foreign aid funding, even if that bilateral funding sets as its own objective the development of civil society, or the development of like a strong women's rights movement or whatever they want to call it. Even then, they can hardly bring themselves to do it. And so, like, especially in the women's rights sector that I know, some donors, both bilateral and foundation, have heard that message from their grantees and have tried to accommodate it, and they've tried to introduce sort of core funding, but it's so timid. And it's basically you only get that core funding once as a grantee you've jumped through so many hoops through so many years that you're considered perfectly safe. You know what I mean? Like it's again not it's sort of like a reward at the end of a journey. And at that point it's like the fact that some of these sort of like graduates of this long journey, very few, like a very small share, get this reward. It just puts them sort of in an elite status, and that is actually not good for overall sort of civil society and movement development because it creates different classes within the sector. And it's definitely handled that way. Like in Georgia, for example, which is a country that, were 30 years of Western funded NGO development. This has had one of the most extreme experiments. Anyway, they now basically has an NGO aristocracy. It has an NGO elite. They're locally referred to as the rich or the wealthy NGOs that have budgets of, 7 figures every year. And they actually go to other NGOs and tell them, haha, look at us. Most of our funding is core funding, and what goes unsaid and what they would probably consider even like a badge of honor is that their ideas of what needs to happen in their country are so perfectly aligned with what foreigners think needs to happen in their country that there isn't even any need anymore to like give them prescribed projects to do. And I don't know why they see it as a badge of honor, but they do. And I mean, this is also why their era in Georgia now is over, but it's a very recent development.
And this would also create a kind of receiver class, the people who get repeatedly the same grants.
Oh, absolutely.
And they are the ones making the decisions. They're not elected bodies, but with the grants that they're receiving, not in all cases, some of these grants, though, can be substantial, and they can mean that they have the power to employ dozens and dozens of people or not. How does that translate within local society, however? Because in your testimony, I believe that you gave in the Congress last year, where you talk about a longtime American philanthropic leader who told you privately, we've behaved inappropriately. This was in Georgia.
They captured the policymaking. That's what was going on here. And frankly, they weren't even secretive about it. And they aren't secretive today, like even to this day. So among grant makers, both foundation and government, like bilateral foreign aid, there's funding policymaking or investing in getting policies changed is like a gold standard. It's like the hardest discipline, right? It's like the rocket science of grant making and foreign aid. And the idea being is that it's like an elegant solution to problems, right? Because instead of it's a fantasy, of course, because the notion is that, well, if you can change the laws, you change everything, right? If you change the policies, you no longer have to work on fixing the problem, but you sort of go to the core of it. And of course, what they then so they actually pride themselves on it. Like they will put it in their reports. We got that many, our grantees advocated for this many laws. you can find and got them passed, and for the benefit of, like, could be a law on violence against women, right? Or it is literally in grant contracts where they say, like, they go in, they make a grant call, and the grant call says, well, we want, policy changes in this and that field. And then, send us your applications and, with your, like, lobbying strategies or whatever, with your contacts, with your, list your previous successes. And then when you're awarded the grant, you have to sign a grant contract, and the grant contract will literally say, like, we set out, or we promise to work on passing this and that law. Like, you can literally, like, say this many laws. And this is and the weird thing is that they've gone so far down their rabbit hole of being successful philanthropists and change makers and whatnot, that they've sort of developed television and no longer see or hear the alarm bells about democratic sovereignty, right? Foreigners should not, be involved in the lawmaking in any country. It's sort of like a very basic middle school civics class idea about sovereignty. Like, this cannot go well. And it's also not, because not only do you have a foreigner taking over, but you also sort of you skip ahead of the domestic mobilization that would be necessary to do it otherwise. The process of mobilizing people, mobilizing certain population groups for certain political changes, that is actually the way in which we build civil society and build our movements, right? And raising money from them in the process, right?
Right. Except with NGOs, you don't have any kind of electoral oversight because these aren't.
They're not elected. I mean, you don't need electoral oversight. Like, if I today go out in my community and with my friends lobby for something and create a movement and bring other people in and raise money for that movement, I don't need to be elected to do that. I get my mandate from the people who are with me on the streets, in my social media groups, in my register of, card carrying members, whatever. That is perfectly fine. In fact, it's excellent. It's what you want. But that work gets skipped. You sort of, like, as a shortcut. If this process now exists entirely in sort of like a triangle, where in one corner you have a foreign donor, in another corner you have the government, in the third corner you have NGOs who are funded by that donor and talk to the government, right? In that triangle, there is no more corner for the people. Nobody needs to talk to them. And nobody does. And as a result, the ideas that the population may actually, or parts of the population may well be very receptive for, and in fact be hungering for, that discussion isn't had, that discourse isn't honed, those arguments aren't fleshed out, the mobilization isn't happening. And then what we see is that when laws are passed on the basis of this construct, of this constellation, they lack the foundation of a constituency in the community. And so they don't get implemented because the constituency building is skipped, right? And that would be, so, like, again, like, I talk a lot about laws on violence against women, and because that's an area that I know well, but it's also one of those fashionable areas that donors have picked out in the last 10, 15 years, particularly in the EU's periphery, but not only. And so when I say constituency building, it would also be important to include the police and police unions in this, right? Or like doctors and nurses, whatever. Like, you need to bring everybody to the table. And in a country where this process is not captured, that would happen. Because, in the West, no government, no coalition would pass such laws without talking to the police unions and the nurses unions and the social workers and blah, 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 blah. Because these are their constituents, right? They put them in office, so they can't skip those steps. That's what's lost ultimately.
I think as well, it can't be overstated that in the countries where you have the more elite classes participating in the NGOs, that there's even less of an incentive to then consult with the people whom they are ostensibly serving, the poor, let's say.
I mean, I think it's really important to understand is that none of this is cut in stone. This is all very fluid. So it's fluid for a while, and then it sort of freezes and sets, right? And so what happens is that it's not that elite classes dominate the NGO sector, but that the NGO sector creates a new elite, right? That's the thing, because it is in a lot of places it is sort of one of the largest industries that offers employment at a very good pay for the highly educated. Right, these are countries that cannot offer their civil servants and their judges a good sort of upper middle class income. These are countries that don't have large white collar industries that would offer them this kind of income. These are countries where academia, forget schools, but I mean even universities, even university professors make incomes that are they're laughable, they're symbolic, and so the NGO sector in some of these countries becomes like the investment banking sector in the US. It is a place where you sort of like were the top 10% for the top 10% or the top 5% or something. Now, I think it's also really, really, really important to understand that simultaneously, this NGO sector is a very flat pyramid. So there are lots and lots and lots of people at the bottom trying to get in and sort of stringing themselves along on tiny grants, occasional funding, part-time work, and only a very tiny elite that actually then makes up that top 10 or 5%. Like it's not like this isn't you're like even the US, if you're an investment banker, um, you're going to be, if you're an investment banker, you're going to be okay. Like if you work for an investment bank as an investment banker, you're going to be okay. If you're an NGO worker in a country like Georgia, 90% of them are not actually doing all that great. Many of them, perhaps the bulk, will make a total income, stretched out year by year that is maybe not all that greater than they would as a teacher. It is a very large sector, and at the very top of it are people who are disproportionately wealthy and engage in practices that you could qualify as basically just sinecures and rents, in addition to their incomes. That's also something to understand. Like, I think what I would also, just like I don't dislike this sort of this caricature, this stereotype of NGOs all being, CIA astroturfed puppets, which is nonsense. I also dislike that idea that everybody who works for an NGO anywhere in the world, foreign funded, is like has a full-time job that immediately puts them in the top 5%. This is not true at all. It's a very weirdly organized industry. I often think like we would never tolerate that only 10% of our dentists can make a full-time livable livelihood from their work, and 90% have to struggle and only get to do work a few times a year and get paid for it. It almost needs to be, it's a little bit like the influencer industry or maybe acting or so. We're only a very tiny elite, and often by serendipity and chance make it to the top, and then they stay there, right? And we're like, you have so many others that are struggling to get there forever.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Haiti was particularly interesting because right after the earthquake in January of 2010, when I was in any kind of the UN, it was called MINUSTA tent, on this piece of land in the middle of Port-au-Prince, I would see the regular drivers, people who went and fetched water, made coffee, brought food. They were always local Haitians. So it was very out of Africa, the film. You'd see this kind of colonial backdrop of Haitians doing menial labor. They were rarely at the table. They were rarely any of the people who would be P3s, P4s, P5s within that sector. And I would talk with the other UN workers who were coming from all over the world. I was working with someone who was from Sri Lanka, in the top 1% of the wealthiest families. And this was just par for the course. And so this makes me think about the kind of ubiquitous reality of what's being done here in the name of development. You were a witness at a hearing of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the U.S. Congress. It was called Laws Regulating Foreign NGOs. human rights implications, wherein you detailed your work with NGOs in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, and there especially in the North Caucasus, in Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia, and Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. In your testimony, you discuss the foreign-funded NGO sector in its realities and structural problems. And I'm wondering if you saw a lot of this when you were there as well. There are people who, like the people who were driving for the UN, they were just happy to have a job. They were happy to have a paying job. They were happy to be fetching water because it was better than doing nothing and being poor. When you made your testimony to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, were you able to cover some of these problems where not only you talk about the problems of money and power, but the idea of how this kind of desperation also ushers forth the questions that nobody wanted asked in the first place. There's an assumption that development is needed in the sectors that Western governments or Western NGOs think is needed because no one's asking the people driving the cars and fetching the water what they need. Because what Haitians will tell you then, and they'll tell you now, we just want jobs. That's all they want. They want jobs. They don't need a UNDP camp built in the middle of a gravel graveyard. The Sean Penn project is what he did in La Corée. They need a housing in places where there's water, where there's electricity. Instead, what happened there in Haiti is Penn and company developed this project in the middle of a pile of stones that left people in even hotter, literally, they were baking under the sun conditions. Well, there was no plan, because they let a Hollywood actor take over, to figure out how these people are going to be bussed into Port-au-Prince. This was way outside of the capital. They had no clue what they were doing.
Yeah, these stories are very common. I mean, you can basically hear them in any crisis you go. And Haiti is just sort of, it's like the worst example of all probably in the world. I mean, I think places like Kosovo, was basically run like a colony with the viceroy. Um, Similar in some ways, but like, yeah, so like Haiti is one of these sort of case studies that everybody cites as just complete overreach and insanity. But I mean, as far as like who works at the UN doing which jobs, the UN is a very old organization, and it comes out of a period in the mid 20th century when people had very sort of, I want to say, almost like sweetly earnest ideas about how well-meaning foreigners would go into another country, and they wouldn't even need to be Westerners. You could be from anywhere. Like, you could be from anywhere in the world and go into another country, and there you would be in charge of that particular office because you would be an outsider and therefore objective. And it would also be international solidarity. So the UN wasn't like, here's a bucket of money, now go locally and just have local people do the whole thing. Like, the idea is always that foreigners, they're always, the head of the office is most likely a foreigner, and like all the senior staff are. And then where locals are hired as national officers, they have a completely different spreadsheet of income. Like, there's one spreadsheet of people who are there as foreigners, and then there's a different spreadsheet for people who are there as locals. Now, I have to be said, the pay that the UN offers to its national staff is typically the highest in the entire NGO and aid industry. And it is therefore, it sets the standard. And this is actually controversial because there are two moral questions here you have to answer. There are two moral arguments here in answer to the question of how much should we pay people. And one argument is we should pay them as much as they would make locally, with their qualifications, like as much as a teacher would make, or a bank teller, or I don't know, some servant in a ministry or civil servant in a ministry. And that is one argument. So it should be the same, and so that the same people would apply, and it wouldn't create inequalities. The other moral argument is that we should pay them so much that they should be able to afford a comfortable middle class life in local conditions. And so in like Ukraine, for example, right now, or even just years ago when I last checked, a local officer, a national program officer would make, several $1,000s equivalent a month. That is 10 times more than what a teacher or a civil servant would make. And so this is a discussion, like the UN has basically come down on one side of this moral argument question by saying they should have this standard. And you could also go to the other side, but then the reality would be that you would pay people so much that they couldn't even feed their families. And so it's a constant quandary. And so I've read a story last year or 2 years ago in the Baffler. It was reported where actually in Sudan, I think, communities literally went to the UN and said, look, if you insist on hiring people and giving them these extraordinary, exorbitant salaries, then at least only hire them for like a month and then circle on the next guy. So that this resource, this extraordinary resource, is shared equally. And of course, the UN can't do that because, they can't function that way. But like these are difficult questions, and it's actually not easy to come up with a good answer for them. It certainly wouldn't be a good answer to say, well, we should just pay all the locals as much as we pay the international staff, because you would sort of like propel them again to like investment banker, tech bro level income, which is also not, that's not a moral solution. The question of like, do locals meaningfully participate in how development for their communities and humanitarian support and social justice and economic justice is done? No. I mean, they're not. And because these are not democracies, they're not accountable. They're not of these communities, they're not of these countries, and they're not accountable to them except through very strange roundabout mechanisms. They all need like a memorandum of understanding from the government to even be there. But, if you're like the Haitian government post the latest earthquake or civil war, like you don't have a meaningful oversight or accountability over entities on whom your entire survival as a state depends. Because when you pull a plug, then, you're also out of loans from the international financial institutions, and then things really go bust. So yes, these are not democracies. These are not participatory. Now, I will say that many development agencies and many offices on the ground, and even policymakers, like at all layers of the system, you will find good people who have, hundreds and thousands of reports and books have been written about this, and who try to do that, who try to be participatory and listen to local demands. Like it's like the number one rule is when you go in is like, listen to the locals, do what they think is best, follow their example, involve them in decision making. And they try to do that, but then someone somewhere else could be a senator in the US makes a really dumb decision because somebody in some entity in his district needs, a contract. And I mean and I'm having a discussion as if this was all still pre-Trump. Now post-Trump and post the destruction of US aid, I don't even know what's going on. I mean, who even knows, right? At least, like US aid, such as it was, and similar institutions were a beast that we knew and with whom we could, talk and have very intelligent and meaningful conversations about what they were doing wrong. US aid produced more reports about what they were doing wrong than anybody else. The problem was that they weren't following their own advice much of the time. But all through the system, there were people who knew exactly what they were doing wrong and how it could be done better. But even if you did it better, it still doesn't solve the fundamental flaw in the constellation that you cannot fake accountability. Like accountability, if you're the Soros Foundation or if you're the Ford Foundation, or even if it doesn't matter, if you're a foreigner coming in with money, you can engage in petite little, bougie games of accountability, but then never the real deal. Because if one day in your community meeting that you've called in for accountability to say, actually, we hate everything you do and you should do everything differently, you don't need to listen to them. And they can't do nothing about it. So it's not really accountability, right?
Right. Plus, there's a larger problem here, which I'd like to ask your views on, is that when my friend called what was happening in the UN in Haiti, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, noting all these contracts that lasted anywhere from 30 to 90 days in general, he said, what can happen? But the bigger criticism here is NGOs are there to sort of put a bandage on a larger problem. Policies emanating from, let's say, World Bank, IMF policies, governments like the US that are putting external pressure or are starving people through various political machinations, right? And we saw this in Iraq. We've seen this in Cuba. We've seen this in many countries that the U.S.
You can see it just about anywhere.
Yeah, pretty much. And so, is there a role for NGOs to play in being able to funnel back up this kind of criticism and saying, well, we can create this and this and this development project?
Oh, they do. I mean, they do. I think this is a conversation that's extremely, that none of this is new. This conversation is being had all the time. These things are not going badly because people don't know better. These things are not going well. These things are going badly because of structural material reasons. I would call those are matters of power and accountability. That ultimately, the people who make these decisions are not accountable to the people about whom they make these decisions. They are only accountable to their own voters and taxpayers, in a very limited way, as we know. But they're not, and you cannot fake that. You cannot you cannot fill that void of genuine accountability with faux little mechanisms of community consultations, you know? Community consultations, like on the ground, that can be if it's well moderated, if it's well done, that can be an inspiring, meaningful, epic conversation, of genuine human connection and learning. If you go into like a village and you bring in all the parents and the children and you have a conversation about the school and what needs to be done and how to do it better, and it can be beautiful, it can be meaningful, it can be the good thing, but in the end, the levers by which it is decided what happens with which resources and whether or not these resources come in, the people in this meeting do not have their hands on that lever. And you cannot, and all the beautiful, meaningful human engagement cannot ever overcome that problem. This is also why I ultimately had to like step away from this work, because you cannot forever operate in sort of a faux space. It's very frustrating. It's all the stories you told me, all the experiences you have. I know you wrote a book about the Haitian experience, and the Haitian experience, like I said, is sort of like a notorious example in our field. Everybody knows this. Everybody talks about it. Like I said, USAID, before its demise, published entire libraries worth of everything they and their field does wrong and how it could be done better. And only, to find its own staff members, well-meaning, intelligent, compassionate people who often share many of our ideas, sort of foundering when they run against reality. You cannot fake your way out of this conundrum that the power vertical runs not along, it doesn't go from the money to the people who are affected. It goes somewhere else, to another side. Does that make sense? And by the way, I couldn't talk about these things during this hearing because when you do a hearing, you have like 3 minutes to speak or 5 or something. And so you submit this very long statement and then you have to like condense it and shorten it. And no, it's like it's not a great way to actually get all of your ideas out there. I feel some people are very good at this. The topic that I was asked to talk about is as we're seeing here, is one with many, many rabbit holes, and it's very complex and it often gets very abstract. And yet there are also lots of like sort of lived experiences and stories that you want to tell. So yeah, it's hard to get all of it out there in a congressional hearing.
And that's why I suspected that you penned your piece last year for Jacobin, Western-backed NGOs, a hollow version of civil society. I'd like, if you could, to discuss this article, because therein you write, quote, Donald Trump's moves to dismantle USAID clearly aren't driven by fears of infringing on other nations' sovereignty. Still, we should recognize the Global South NGOs' reliance on Western donors hinders the growth of self-sustaining civil societies. And in this, you examine the Supreme Court Citizens United ruling in 2010 and how in the U.S., quote, both major parties are thoroughly and openly, even proudly, beholden to big donors, end quote. And there you spring into what happened in the 2021 case in Austria with Thomas Schmidt, a senior political appointee to the Ministry of Finance, who had texted officials, "Don't forget, you are the whore of the rich." So you use these historical instances to note the interconnectivity of money and power and how they are connected, and how that, quote, money flowing from powerful interest groups therefore needs to be publicized, thoroughly scrutinized, and regulated. And you write, "We know this, but we do not apply this knowledge when we funnel our money into the NGOs and political systems of the Global South." Citizens United told a tale that unlimited and non-transparent money flowing into politics is an indispensable component of freedom of speech. Immediately and intuitively, we understand how problematic this is, how this interpretation twists the concepts of freedom and speech beyond recognition, weaponizing them for powerful interests. End quote. You then go on to discuss the many late nights and hundreds of grant applications you wrote for and with NGOs, your lobbying of foundations, embassies, and aid agencies on behalf of grassroots activists. And you write, "Then I watched again and again how the money I had secured would enable these activists to do good work, yet simultaneously entrap them in a vicious cycle of material and psychological dependence and the political repression that descended on them precisely because their work was funded by foreigners. And then I tried to mobilize against that fallout too." Can you discuss this kind of dynamic that you witnessed over and over, it would seem?
I should just say, when I wrote the article, I first wrote it in German in fall 2024, and then the English version came in early 2025, right around the time that the Trump administration started. And it was actually before the USAID, or maybe just right at the time that the USAID debacle started. So the article was written specifically in response to a discussion that was then going on about, which still exists in a way, but it's almost been eclipsed by recent events, so-called foreign agent laws. When governments that receive aid pass laws that oblige, yeah, I think ultimately want to, because these governments are concerned about what NGOs with foreign funding do to their countries. It could be because of paranoia, but it could also be that they have a pretty good reason for that paranoia. Usually it's a mix of both. And then this was something that happened over the last 15 years, again and again and again. The countries are doing that, and then there was sort of an outcry, and there was sort of like, "Oh my God, how dare you do that? How dare you control this funding? It's like, it's part of freedom of association, blah blah blah. Like Citizen United, it's like, it's money is freedom of speech. How dare you, restrict that?" And I said, actually, we do need to talk about it. Money's power. So, why shouldn't we talk about it? And why should we be opposed to the very basic minimum, which is transparency? People should know where money, what funds what work, who funds what work, for what reason. It's, basic stuff. Shouldn't be controversial. So that's the first argument. The second issue that you've talked about is what happens in civil society when your funding always comes from foreigners. And foreigners is one thing. I mean, something very similar can happen if you're like an American, community-based organization, a nonprofit somewhere, and your main or only source of income are grants from various grant makers, typically private and public foundations, because this is often the same frustrations that they have all the money and all the power, and all you can do is sort of hope that you're lucky that they like you. And so you study them, and um, because they hold all the power, you have to do a lot of things. You have to study them. You have to sort of predict where they're going. You have to guess what they like. Sometimes they say that very clearly what they want, like they want this or that idea. That also changes all the time, right? Because some foundations also have their own sort of programmatic staff whose job it is to basically just find out what's going on in the world, or on the contrary, to set the agendas of what they think should be going on in the world. Ideas, right? About social and political and cultural and other issues. And so you have to guess at that, or you have to study that, and then you have to contort yourself in your own work so it fits. Now, there are people like I said, who are lucky that, whatever they believe in and do fits exactly. But that's very rarely the case. It can happen at times that foundations basically, together with like-minded allies, create organizations that are already a very good fit for that organization, for that foundation, and it's a sort of like, an incestuous process, but it's also not a secret. It happens quite a bit that sort of foundations are present at the creation, right? Like they are the origin story of some organizations, especially organizations with very specific mandates, missions. And then you have to write these things, and then even if you do everything right, you still might not win it, because fundamentally, like I said, the sector is a very sort of flat pyramid where you have a very wide bottom of those who are constantly struggling. It's hyper competitive. There's this idea is dangled out there that you can do good things in the world, the things that you're fascinated by, that you feel passionate about, your cause, the work on the problems that you see around you in the world, and that for some reason, magically, miraculously, there are rich institutions, sources of money, who will give you money to do this work. And that's a very alluring thought. And it's alluring to a lot of people, way more than there is actually money for. And that's sort of a chronic constellation in the sector. It's a very dysfunctional industry and sector in that way. Like I said, I compare it to dentistry, but you could do for anything. Well, it could be math teachers. We would find it completely absurd that only 10% of people who are trained math teachers get to make a full-time permanent income from their work, and that the rest would have to hustle and only do it part-time and do other work, and maybe once every year to get 2 months of math teaching. We would think that's crazy, but in the NGO sector, both in our own countries, but specifically in foreign aid dependent countries, that is a reality that we accept. Although I think a lot of grant makers, a lot of institutions who do that, they often blind themselves to the fact that besides the people, the organizations that they fund, there are many others that they did not fund. That is a very willful blindness, because they have received the grant applications and reviewed them, and they know that they rejected 50, 70, 90%. I mean, I've been a reviewer for UN Trust Fund, which is one of these like big UN grant making mechanisms that are actually open to pretty much all of the developing world. So you get a lot of applications, and these trust funds, they exist for things like democracy and peace and violence against women, and they, as a rule, I think they support 1 to 3% of the applications they get. It is a hyper competitive and therefore extremely dysfunctional sector in which a lot of money, a lot of time and effort and energy and expertise, and therefore money, resources, is wasted on the search for the fuel for actually doing the work. And in such a dysfunctional environment, you are in a state of chronic despair, stress, and also under the constant pressure to like conform and contort yourself so that you can stay afloat, possibly. And that's what I described there in this passage, or what I tried to describe. Like, it's very hard to be happy in this sector.
The thing that you do in the article, it's really well done, the way you link the various issues, the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, I guess as it would be called in the EU, which is also under scrutiny since the Internet Act went into vigor. And the fact that you have these bodies that are holding a potential great amount of political weight. Who decides who gets the money? Who decides who gets the voice, right? So you talk about how Citizens United tells this tale of non-transparent, unlimited flows of money into politics. While you note that this is indispensable to free speech, you also question this. How could we solve the system as it currently stands? What do you see as possible solutions to this when, as you have witnessed and experienced firsthand, the actors at the table, it could be the roll of the dice, it could be, how do we know why 10% of mathematicians hold jobs? A lot of it has to do with the economy, for sure. But when you're talking about a link to foreign funds and being able to sit at that table, there are other politics that go into operation that make that decision as well. So what would you suggest to be stops to these kinds of influences of money?
So I think you can't do it by technocratic trickery, and you can't do it by these like boutique little like kumbaya circles of let's all listen to each other, because they're ultimately window dressing. So I just want to be very blunt about this. Like, we have to talk about the fact that, there are only certain ways in which we can hold power accountable, and that is by also holding power, right? So, and that can be faked. Like, you just ultimately cannot fake it, right? Like, the only way that um, any rich billionaire grant maker, and I'm not going to name names here because it doesn't even matter which one of them it is, that they could be ultimately accountable is if they relinquish their money, if they just gave it away. And the Austrian heiress that I describe in this, hers is a very interesting case in that she, Marlene Engelhorn, right? She not only she inherited a fortune first from her grandmother. She stands to probably inherit again from her parents. There's a much greater fortune, but the like 30 million euros she inherited from her grandmother, she didn't just give away to causes that she decided, or to causes that, you know, technocratic, professional, managerial types that she hired decided she should give them to. But she did one of these like what do you call them, like public assemblies or community panels, where she basically she had randomly selected a statistically representative group representing Austrians, and they decided where her money would go. And the way she said it is not, she says, not just to give back, but she returns the money. She returns the money to where she knows it came from. And that is the ultimate way in which we could solve this problem. And I also want to say specifically about foreign aid, and I don't know if it's in this article or if I said it elsewhere. And I'm not saying anything original here, like this has been said by many people, and people much more eminent than me, that foreign aid is essentially a fraud and a scam, while we don't do debt relief and debt forgiveness for developing countries, because the developed world, rich countries earn more on interest payments of debt than they give in foreign aid, across this sector. So I think these are sort of like, if this sound, it's not radical, it's radical in the sense that it goes to the root of the problem. This is an unequal exchange, right? So before anyone who says like we need to radically tackle the problem of dysfunction in the sector, I have to tell to them, like, what are you going to do about debt relief for developing countries? What are you going to do about unfair terms of trade? This is really interesting because we're obviously in a period now where we're making the terms of trade more unfair again, where that seems to be where we're headed globally. But I find it hard to talk about solutions outside of, by eclipsing these greater issues, because that means they remain window dressing, boutique, like sort of self-congratulatory things we might do. I also, I hold it with Bernie Sanders, and it's like every billionaire is a policy problem. There shouldn't be billionaire foundation donors. Like, that money needs to be returned to society, and there should be um, redistribution. There should be pre-distribution. This, like, this is in the age of the global oligarchs. Like, these messages seem almost quaint, right? I think it's also, there's no other way around it, to think through this.
The case of the heiress giving back the money, she broke many codes, especially amongst the elite, that you should never discuss money, right? This has been an
Yeah.
age-old problem. And we see this even within, let's say, the land registry of the United Kingdom, where not all the land is registered, and there's a reason for that. It's very convenient to those in power that the people not know how much
Yeah.
land is owned by them. And I'll never forget when was the Duke of Westminster, I believe, died about 10 years ago. And we all found out through the Daily Mail that he owned a huge chunk of central London. Like, he was richer than God probably literally,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there's a convenience in this never talking about money. And what I really liked about your piece as well is you talked directly to the kind of taboos that she broke, and this installation of thinking that money should necessarily be part of the
I
public
mean,
purse.
yeah. Public person, like pre-distribution. Like, I mean, she really, like, she's very clear. She has written a brilliant book and it's called Geld in German, which means money. And it's all about sort of like how money is equals power and what it does to you individually as a rich person, and what it makes you think. And like, she has these very funny examples. Like, she compares rich philanthropists to Batman. She says, Batman is this superhero who like goes around and sort of from his lair and like violently supposedly solves crime. But she says, really, he's a criminal and he should be arrested. And like rich philanthropists who think that their money gives them the power to sort of do in society, to like conduct their like crude political experiments on society. We shouldn't celebrate them as heroes, but we should say, like, who do you think you are to be telling us, how our schools should be run, how our traffic should be directed, all of these things. So, and I really hope that that book will be translated into English, because she's a brilliant philosopher, not just, someone who happened to be born rich. But nobody could have told that story, that particular story about money, the way she does. I just find it really hard to talk about the problematic constellations and toxicities that philanthropy and foreign aid and similar mechanisms of charity, of charitable giving, throw up and reproduce again and again and again, without talking about the greater issues around them that create these agglomerations of wealth from which then pennies can be given as supposed charities. And like I said, the window dressing mechanisms for brushing over or smoothing out on the surfaces, they have been shown to be inadequate for the last, I want to say 20 years, something like this. Participatory grant making has been a very sort of a trend, a fashion in the sector. Um, and the idea is that the communities that will ultimately benefit from this funding from private philanthropies, would decide where the money goes. But the way it has been handled has been so cautious, so twee, so self-congratulatory, and so safe, that it's just been a caricature for the most part. So like, one of the ways in which participatory grant making is done by some foundations, public and private, is they basically ask all of their former grantees to decide who should be the next grantees. Now, what is your immediate reaction to that idea?
Nepotism.
Yes, well, nepotism, cliquishness, elite preservation, cattiness, backstabbing,
And no challenge of the ideas that you've held.
no challenge of the ideas, no challenge of your power. And also, basically, you have to belong to this like elite club. You have to be anointed into this elite club of all the right thinking people. You're actually not the community. You're not the beneficiaries. Sometimes they do bring in the ultimate sort of beneficiaries, like the actual women who are affected by this, like women who are actual survivors of domestic violence, for example. And they bring them in usually, when they do, in very small doses and only for consultative functions, not for actually making decisions. And then I have to say, even if you brought in money, has this thing like money, when I talk about the Midas touch, like, when you think about these things, it has an effect on people. When you actually bring in a woman or several women who've been survivors of domestic violence, who have been helped by or these types of organizations, and you ask them, well, who should get it? The moment you give her that power, things change for her and she changes. We all do. We all do when we are put in a situation like this. When we're giving the role to decide who should get money, to do things in the world, to make the world different. You could say to make the world better, but to make the world different. When we're given that power, we change, psychologically, but also in terms of sort of positionality, if you will. And so these are all considerations, and that's why I think all of these like mechanisms that have been thought up to ostensibly deal with these problems, they're deficient, they're window dressing.
We're not addressing something here that needs to be discussed. So you hear it a bit with people like Mamdani saying there shouldn't be the billionaire class at all. Let's see if he acts on that. On the other hand, where NGOs are concerned directly, you see the shifting of the deck chairs on the Titanic in a very perverse way. And this is it. You've witnessed this. I've seen this. There's an earthquake. I'll use Haiti as an example. There's an earthquake in Haiti. That earthquake was very quickly deemed to have done so much damage because of the very cheap building structures where there was too much sand being poured into the cement. So the idea that you have this combination of elements, but the cheaper element is in excess, that's what caused the pancaking of all those buildings. So that's blamed on quote unquote idiocy of Haitian engineers when that's not at all what happened. This is about dependency politics once again, where Haiti was underdeveloped consciously. So what happens is earthquake comes in decades later after we've supported Papa Doc, and we have then come in with our NGO and USAID and all our funding to help out these people that we ourselves have underdeveloped consciously. So we created the field of disaster. Then we come in with our umbrellas and our banners saying, we're here to help you. But there's no discussion that we created the situation in the first place. So what I see is this very perverse engineering of destruction, reparation going on around. It's not just Haiti, as you know. This happens all over the world. What kinds of checks and balances are there where NGOs are beholden to their grant makers, but everyone who's on the ground knows that this situation was created by this kind of colonial capitalism profiting off of and creating more poverty?
I think the general problem that I see is that a lot of problems, there's a saying that if you can't solve a problem, make it bigger, or if you can't solve a conflict, make it bigger. And so the question of why is it that a woman who has been trained with job skills and gets hired doesn't earn enough money to pay rent for housing, for herself? Um, the question is that obviously you have a completely dysfunctional housing market in that particular economy, and then you have to ask yourself, why is that? And you get to questions like why, maybe the answer would be social housing or government subsidized housing. But these are all issues you can't get into. I mean, first of all, because you can't get into it because you're already working overtime just helping victims of domestic violence, but also because, like there's no intellectual framework for talking about this, and you would step on a lot of toes all around. Or also because the development model of your country, but then also that your donors favor is a sort of an unquestioned free market model. And speaking to issues like the fact that, even doing supposedly right thing and getting job skills and working full time doesn't buy you as much as a roof over your head. There's just no space for that discourse. So it's often hard to make the problem, for practical and political reasons, it's hard to make the problem as big as it needs to be to talk about issues. So I want to talk about the nomenclature, the way that we talk about this, because I think it's really, really interesting. And so the big term in the center of this is the term NGO. And it's a term of art. It's an artificial term that was actually created out of an embarrassment, right? It has a lot to do with like Tehila Sassoon's sort of the dynamic that she describes here, how like after World War II, during the Cold War, the focus of development organizations was on interpersonal, like people to people solidarity and away from the state, and how that sort of conflated with like liberal and then neoliberal ideas of how government should, especially governments in the third world, could not be trusted with the development of their states and their communities. And so this is where then, like I think the term was NGO actually was point, I don't know, I want to say in the 80s or something. And it describes something that isn't there, right? So what is there, sort of the default would have been to fund governments to do this work. and to work with governments. Like foreign aid was supposed to work with governments, right? Government to government. And that still exists. Like bilateral budget support is still a component of foreign aid. In order to describe sort of the antidote or like the non-default model to that, they started calling them non-governmental. And it's very interesting that for decades we used that term only to talk in the foreign aid context. Like in the 1990s, it would have been absurd for an American to talk about Human Rights Watch as an NGO, right? Or the American Civil Liberties Union, right? Like if somebody would have referred to the American Civil Liberties Union in 1989 as an NGO, people would have looked at them, what are you talking about? You know, in the US, people talk about them in the English-speaking discourse. We talk about them as nonprofits or as charities. And that reflects the legal status that they hold. And the legal status that they hold comes out of our very, very old legal histories and sort of the institutions and mechanisms and types of corporations we have. So in common law, you have the concept of a not-for-profit, which is, the opposite of a for-profit corporation. Corporations are for profit, and if they're not for profit, you designate them that to highlight that fact. So a non-profit or not for profit. In the UK would be the word charity, which is a specific legal mechanism. Charity, yeah, it's
No, I giggle because I'm an American and I'm used to hearing NGOs, nonprofits. And when I got to England and was living there and heard charity, it's a wonderful term because it sort of confesses what it is, if you know what I mean. This kind of thinking that we're helping. NGO and nonprofit sterilize that kind of neocolonial giving.
Correct. But in common law, they are still created on the model of a corporation. Like an LLC or a joint stock company, a corporation, which is a legal person. In the German Central European legal tradition, the model is that of association, Verein, which is the German word, which literally means union, like coming together, unifying people. And the idea is that it describes an entity that, so it's not defined as a corporation, but as a legal person that is characterized by bringing people together, uniting them for joint action. And so we have all of these different concepts that have given names, and that that reflect very much how we think about these entities in our societies and in the laws and norms that govern our societies. And then we go outside our own communities and countries, and we conduct foreign aid, and we call them NGOs. And so there we set them up in clear contrast to governments, which could be the alternative partner, and in many ways always were and still are. But this big new thing came up, and it exploded from the 1990s, by the way. Like before that it existed, but like in the 1990s, the numbers exploded. And already in the 1990s, Michael Edwards, with a co-author that I've forgotten, but Michael Edwards like literally wrote the book on civil society. It's called Civil Society. In the 1990s, he was already able to diagnose that from the moment that NGOs, nonprofits, whatever, INGOs, international NGOs, became the main contractors or became a growing sector of contractors in the foreign aid industry, their donations and contributions from ordinary citizens dropped. So the moment money, like government money with its agendas and its overwhelming power comes in, it changes the character of these institutions. And charities become NGOs, right? They become contractors for foreign aid and thought about that way. And it's very interesting that in recent years, this nomenclature of the NGO, of the thing that it does, like this elite affiliated foreign unaccountable actor that the word NGO has come to mean, has remigrated back sort of into the motherland and now describes institutions that have been created frequently in the very recent past, the last few decades, even the last few years, and that play a very specific role in our own communities, now in our own countries, in our own political economies. And I would classify them as social enterprises. And the reason, and of course, that can mean a lot of things. I mean, some people even describe Martin Luther King as a social entrepreneur. In a narrow sense, to me, it means this particular business model where you have a great idea. It's an idea to make the world a better place to diagnose and treat a particular social problem. And in order to realize it, you basically make a pitch instead of mobilizing your community and solving it together with them, as the Verein would, unifying for joint action or for engaging in your joint interests. You make a pitch to investors and you make it viable as an income generating model, as one that, it covers payroll. Still doesn't, it's a nonprofit, right? So it can't actually make a profit, but, it's supposed to cover all your costs, make payroll, pay rent, and you pitch to investors essentially, and you become a social entrepreneur. And so the many sort of like metamorphosis of this idea of legal personhood for joint action is really, really revealing and really telling, I think, and the way we talk about it. When you talk now in sort of in the discourse of certain donors, particularly bilateral donors, they now use CSO, civil society organization, because it's just incredibly neutral, right? It sounds very clinical, but it also, I think, it's behind this very sort of clinical neutral term, which it hides the fact that they claim that civil society, which is a very big thing, right? Like civil society is basically, you can define it in a lot of ways, but in its widest way, it's everything that communities and societies do together in a civil way. It's not me making this up. This is from Michael Edwards again, that they existed, sort of the distillate of that is these social enterprises with their career professionals who pitch to investors or make themselves available to implement contracts, tenders basically for the foreign aid industry, and that is civil society. So there's something very manipulative and very sort of very gaslighting about that term too. And so I think the fact that we have all these different words is very revealing, but it's revealing about how things have been instrumentalized by those with power, and not about activists themselves and the organizations they create, often under pressure, because the only way to be and to be recognized, to be seen, to function at all, is to force yourself into these not so much the legal frameworks. The legal frameworks are often very permissive and easy, but into the political and aesthetic frameworks.
It is interesting because I think a lot of what we're talking about has to do also with money and power. And then on the other side of that, language and the way that language revives a sense of even faux power. When you have people with certain kinds of social or economic agendas on the one side who hold keys to development aid, to funding that, to donor bases, etc. And on the other hand, you have people on the ground, and I'm not talking about INGOs now, I'm talking about NGOs being sponsored, however, by international bodies, who just want to better X situation, whatever that is. I think the idea that one can be an actor in this theater, let's call it, there's a temptation to embrace the language and to hope that if you run fast enough, that something will give, that something will change. One thing I learned while in Haiti was the high attrition rate of people. Basically, when they reached 30, 34, they got out. A lot of people did. And it set up what is called the Peter principle of the most mediocre people staying in, even the most
Absolutely
incompetent staying in, being awarded high positions. I'll give you an example. This was shocking to me. The person who was in head of UNICEF in Haiti when I got there was a Dutch woman whose specialty, she had been in Bermuda, I believe, or the Bahamas right before. She was a logistics specialist who basically moved trucks and cars and which engines were needed here and there. And she became the head of UNICEF. I kid you not. And when I dealt with a P3, she was my go-to person because I was unofficially in the UN. I was working with the UN and I was working also against the UN because I had people approaching me about a lot of corruption that was going on amidst various organizations. I had the head of Save the Children call me into her office to ask me what's going on, because the word on the street, and I was in the country 3 weeks, and I had come across 3 different child trafficking operations, went to this head of UNICEF who told me she wasn't interested. I ended up going to the head of the Haitian police, and he was very aware of what was going on, and he had the best criticism of what was happening at MINUSTA, and he was powerless. This is the thing. So you've got these aid agencies and the UN who have more power than the head of Haiti's police force. Amazing, right? But this was the reality. So, of course, if you're a local actor on the ground, you want to believe that what you're doing will have some signification, right?
Well, I want to say I think it's true that like it is, like I said, it is a sector that because of the factual circumstances, like I would call it's toxic, right? And that is one of the reasons that push people out. Like a lot of people try to hang on through the toxicity and they try to work on the toxicity. Like there's a whole subsector that is about activist well-being and sort of fighting activist burnout. It's a huge subsector, and people build entire careers just on that. And often the people who build these careers are those who are like they were like activists on some actual activism field, and then through their own experiences working with activists and being an activist, they become experts on sort of coping with the toxicity. And I did that, sort of I dipped my toe in that a little bit too, just simply because it was part of managing larger projects, right? But just at some point you realize like the system will forever reproduce toxicity and it cannot be any other way. And sort of you don't want to put a band-aid on that. You need to think deeper about that. It's interesting that you say 34 is when people quit. I read a statistic from the UN. This was a while ago, must be a decade ago, that the UN and I'm guessing this was the secretariat, like not the agencies in the field, but people quit their career paths at average age 43. And there are many reasons for that, and one of them again is that it's a very flat pyramid, and there's only so many paths for advancement. Not everybody can constantly advance in their careers. There's just no room for it. I'm assuming this has gotten much worse because the UN has run into very severe funding problems now, and people are being forced to leave left and right. So when you say they're very young and the dropout age is very young, one effect of that is that they also behave all very young. So like I met people in like their mid-30s or 40s still living this life, and it's actually a weird life. Like they don't have families, they don't have a proper home. They live out of a suitcase. They go to like 5 parties a week, which is not normal when you're 35, I would think. It's a weird, unsettled lifestyle at that level. Now I want to say this is a very specific field. This is the INGO UN side, right? There are people who do this locally in the cities where they were born and grew up, right, who work for foreign funded NGOs. That's a completely different thing. Although part of the glamour is that you're part of this itinerant circus of new foreigners coming in all the time. And it's part of the glamour and the prestige. And it's also part of the reward. Like this, it's also, when you're an activist in your own country, even if you're privileged, and even if you have a well funded NGO, and again, most NGOs are not well funded local NGOs, they're struggling all the time. One of the rewards is like your family doesn't like what you do, your government doesn't like what you do, your community thinks what you do is weird, isn't particularly receptive. But you go to these foreigners and their receptions, and it's like in nice buildings with nice foods, and all those foreigners are so fun and so cool and so friendly, and they totally adore you and they think you do the greatest work. So this is the lifestyle of this is very, very alluring too. But it's also part of it is because like the best people cannot cope with, which in the best case scenario you could call compromises, and in the worst case scenario, like the one you mentioned, where you have just incredibly like violent, like exploitation and abuse within the system, being generated again and again and again and again. And so yeah, like these sectors, and I often talk about this with a young woman in Armenia, actually, a young activist, sort of on the very micro level, the interpersonal toxicities that keep sort of mushrooming the sector, we think is sort of like in this weird sort of metaphysical way, they are a function of the fact that the resources that fuel the sector are so unaccountable to those who are in it and those who stand to benefit from it. Like there has to be a connection between these two things. That's the best I can say about it. And again, like I think there are no easy fixes for it. like you can only heal this by making this, I mean, this is going to sound really radical and sort of almost violent, but by making the whole sector redundant by having a more just system.
I completely agree with you.
It's really hard. It's true. So like sometimes the people who can stay, like these are the people, like I said, the people who succeed in the sector are those who are either really toxic themselves, like that's totally a thing, those who have a strong stomach for this sort of thing, and or those who really don't care, like for whom it's just a day job, right? Like a prestigious one. And it must be said that when you said that, like from in the UN you have people from all over the world, and then you find out that actually they often come from very privileged backgrounds. And then I said, well, but like often the privilege is very positional and sort of happened very sort of serendipitously because they happen to be a refugee in the right refugee camp at the right moment and the only person speaking English there, and through luck and ambition that turned into a UN career. These are people who they already wanted other things out of this career, right? They were already taking, I don't know, maybe huge risks, or they have nowhere else to go. That may also be a reason why they stay, right? Like someone who quits, someone who's from a nice European country, with a nice education, they can quit, some UN agency at 34 over frustration of, having experienced or witnessed sexual harassment, which by the way is so frequent that like everybody's story could be that, and not just in the UN, like all over the place. And then they can just they can go back and do a comfortable PhD, or go back and like get a fellowship at a think tank in their home country because these things exist, like they have somewhere to go back to. And then but like someone who was propelled into a UN career from a refugee camp in South Sudan, and their entire family is like spread out all over the globe or something. They have a passport which may not be too conducive to a settled life. They may not have that choice.